It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. We begin with the stroke of a pen and the power it wields. Last month, President Trump signed an executive order about a weed killer. Not a rare mineral or a weapons system. A weed killer. The order invokes the Defense Production Act. That's a wartime authority. It guarantees the domestic supply of glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, the world's most widely used herbicide. It also gives legal immunity to its producers. Last month on this show, Harvard historian of science Naomi Oreskes told us the landmark safety study behind Roundup was a fraud. Monsanto ghostwrote it. It stood for 25 years. She helped get it retracted. And since we spoke, she's found other ghostwritten papers. Professor Oreskes joins me now. Professor, welcome back.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
So first, when we say glyphosate is the most widely used herbicide, what does that mean for you and me? How likely am I to be exposed to it?
It's extremely likely that we're exposed to it for two reasons. It's extremely widely used in agriculture, particularly in grain crops like soy, corn, and wheat. And that means that residues can end up in our food. And that's not just theoretical. Many studies have shown that common breads that you could buy in the bakery, breakfast cereals, virtually all of these products have at least some degree of glyphosate residue in them. Even ones you might think of as healthy, like I hate to single out a particular product, but Dave's Killer Bread, I'm a big fan of their breads. They have glyphosate residues as well. So very, very hard to avoid. And in addition, Roundup is widely sold to be used around the home and garden. Bayer recently changed the formulations of Roundup so that if you were to go today to buy Roundup, it might not have glyphosate in it. But if you've used Roundup in your home or garden anytime in the past 30 years or so, there's a very high likelihood that you would have been exposed to glyphosate. And again, that's validated by scientific studies that have shown glyphosate in our blood, in our tissues, in mother's milk.
Wow. I mean, I, of course, went down the rabbit hole with glyphosate in preparation for this discussion and for the others that we've had about this. Professor Oreskes, coffee is also a big one. I was reading that coffee is heavily sprayed with glyphosate. And something that I was learning is that if you're choosing the organic option of something such as coffee, you're likely to really minimize your exposure because glyphosate is not allowed in organic practices. Does that track with what you know?
Yes, although, and again, this is going to be a real Debbie Downer of a show.
Oh, no, Professor, what?
I'm sorry. In theory, yes. So in theory, buying certified organic foods is a way to protect yourself. But we also know that there's a lot of lack of enforcement. There's corruption. There's fraudulent things that claim to be organic that come in from other countries that possibly aren't. So if you're interested in pursuing that, I'm a big fan of the Real Organic Project that is tracking these kinds of things. But still, overall, the evidence does support the idea that you'll have less exposure to glyphosate and other pesticide residues if you buy certified organic foods.
Well, I know what we'll be discussing next month, Professor, so thank you for that. I want to go back to Roundup now specifically. I mean, you got one ghost-written Roundup study retracted after 25 years. Now you're finding more. How often are you finding people working in industry like this writing papers that claim things like glyphosate are less dangerous than they actually are? And again, there are tens of thousands of federal court cases right now from people that are alleging that Roundup and glyphosate specifically caused the cancer that they are dealing with.
Well, it's very hard to say exactly how widespread these practices are for the obvious reason that in general, people try to hide fraudulent practices. People don't usually boast about fraud. Although, one of the things that's crazy about this case is that when we get into the documents, we actually do see people boasting about it. We see people patting themselves on the back. Even one case where an email was sent where a guy says to the team, we should all get T-shirts for what we've done here.
These are emails between folks who work for Roundup/Bayer.
Exactly. And so there's a kind of shamelessness, almost pride that some of these people take in what they've gotten away with. There's almost a kind of like frat boy mentality, in my opinion, about some of this. But nevertheless, it's very hard to know for sure. And so part of the challenge of the work we've been doing initially was to track a case that we knew was ghostwritten because that had already been exposed by other people. We're now tracking a couple of additional cases that have actually similarly already been exposed by other people. So we don't have to do the work of finding these particular ghostwritten papers. We have to do the work of now requesting retraction and explaining why this is such an important problem.
Now let's connect the dots, if we could, with President Trump's executive order. So Trump used the Defense Production Act to guarantee glyphosate production. And again, that law was designed for wartime. We're talking steel, ammunition, critical minerals. The president just used it for a weed killer. What does this executive order mean? How can you most plainly connect the dots for us, Professor, between that order and what we're talking about right now?
Well, again, it's very difficult to know exactly what the president was thinking, and I'm not privy, obviously, to the administration's thinking, but it sure seems awfully conspicuous for two reasons. The one is the one you just mentioned. This is an act that was invoked around the time of World War II, specifically for things that were obviously related to the war effort: munitions, rubber for tires, uniforms for troops. A weed killer that's used mostly for domestic agricultural purposes and lawn and gardens, it's hard to see how you make a rational case for this being essential to the war effort. In addition, it's conspicuous because this comes right on the heels of Bayer, who bought Monsanto, who were the primary producers of glyphosate, asking the Supreme Court to indemnify it against civil litigation. And this case is going to the court. The Supreme Court has already agreed it would accept this case. They expect to hear arguments in April, so next month. So this is right about to happen. And the Trump administration has expressed its support for Bayer in this request for total indemnification against legal liability. So it seems hard to believe that these two things are not related.
So, okay, if I'm hearing you right, Professor, Bayer is saying we should not be legally liable for these cancer cases. And the president's executive order extends legal immunity to glyphosate producers. And the glyphosate producer in the U.S. is Bayer. So what does that mean for someone who gets sick? If someone is getting ill, if they get cancer, can they sue the industries that are producing glyphosate in the future, or the company, the one that is Bayer?
Well, the legal landscape is complicated, and I'm not a lawyer. My understanding is that under Defense Production Act, there could be still some cases in which you could have legal redress. But overall, particularly these two cases combined, the Supreme Court case plus the invocation of the executive order, would imply that in the vast majority of cases, a person who became sick and believed their sickness was caused by glyphosate would have little or no legal redress.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. My guest is Naomi Oreskes, historian of science at Harvard. Her work helped retract a 25-year-old fraudulent safety study on glyphosate. That's the active ingredient in Roundup, the world's most widely used weed killer. And she's not done. We're talking about President Trump's executive order protecting glyphosate production, the Supreme Court case that could shut down Roundup cancer lawsuits, and what happens when the science falls apart, but the system keeps building around it. Now, Professor, I want to think about an interesting figure in all of this. RFK Jr. He built his public profile suing Monsanto over Roundup. He helped win one of the first major cancer verdicts. Now he's the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and he's defending this executive order, much to the chagrin of many of his Maha posse. He said banning glyphosate would put 80% of farmers out of business. Here he is discussing glyphosate on Joe Rogan's podcast.
Over the past 60 years, through federal policies and subsidies and the management of farming in this country, the agricultural management, we have addicted our farmers to these pesticides, and particularly glyphosate. Glyphosate is the foundational pesticide of our food production system. 97% of corn in this country is produced with glyphosate and can't be produced without it. 98%, you could do it. You could change it. There's organic corn producers in this country. It's like 3%. 98% of soy is produced with glyphosate. If you ban glyphosate overnight, or if you got rid of it, or if somebody else cut off our supply, it would destroy the American food system. And
how crazy is that statement? The American foods, the entire system is based on using a poison.
Right.
A giggle from Professor Oreskes. I saw you shaking your head back and forth as we were listening to that clip from RFK Jr., who is saying a lot of different things. So let's break some of those things apart. He says that both glyphosate is a killer and that if we remove it from use, our food system will collapse. I believe that was the moment where you really started shaking your head back and forth. Say more.
Well, one of the great things about being a historian is that you sometimes know immediately that someone is lying or that a claim is preposterous because you've heard it all before. So let's go back to DDT. Everyone has heard of DDT, and we all know how it was killing birds across the United States, including the great bald eagle, the symbol of this country. And ultimately, it took about a decade, but ultimately, because of the work of Rachel Carson and many scientists around this country, that chemical was banned for use in the United States. When the proposal was made to phase it out or ban it, the agricultural industry said exactly the same things that we're hearing now about glyphosate. The economy would collapse, we can't grow food, we have to feed the world, and we can't do it without DDT. And that turned out not to be true. The use of these toxic chemicals in agriculture is a kind of laziness. It is true that we have built an agricultural system around this poison, and that's a big problem. And we ought to be taking our intelligence, our ingenuity, our creativity, and figuring out how to build a food system that is not dependent on poisons.
A kind of laziness. That is how you would describe what is happening now when it comes to practices within our agricultural system, practices that are harmful to people's health. You study how industries make their products seem impossible to replace. So you would say, Professor Oreskes, that this is an example of that. This is RFK Jr. parroting that.
Absolutely. We've built a system in which, admittedly, it won't be easy to replace. And the other thing that drives me crazy is when people create the straw man. They say, well, if we eliminated glyphosate overnight. People said the exact same thing about tobacco. People are saying the same thing about fossil fuels today. But nobody is proposing eliminating anything overnight. We all understand that changes in economic systems take time, but the way you begin to do something that takes time is to start, is to take a first step. And the executive order, RFK's comments, the Supreme Court considering indemnifying glyphosate, these are all steps in the wrong direction. They're steps that keep our food system dependent on this highly dangerous chemical, which is now, as we already said, everywhere, including in our own bodies.
I want to think about another aspect of the regulatory framework that is in place in the U.S. The EPA has until October to decide whether glyphosate is safe. The agency is currently run by Lee Zeldin, who wants to cut more than 65% of its staff. You wrote about this in October. Republican politics often orbit around President Trump, and Zeldin is an appointee. Is there any indication that the EPA will rule that glyphosate is unsafe?
Well, it seems very unlikely given what Lee Zeldin has already made very clear, which is that this is not about the science for him, and it's not about public health and safety. It's about deregulation. And he made this very clear in his statements with respect to climate change, and he's made it pretty clear with his statements about other issues as well. Lee Zeldin is part of a program in the Republican Party, not all Republicans, but many, to deregulate the economy, to liberate what they like to call the magic of the marketplace. It's the idea that if you just let the private sector do its thing, it will generate jobs, it will generate economic growth, and we'll all be happy and yay, right? I'm sorry, that was from that old song, oh, we'll all be happy, yay. So I didn't mean homosexual, but well, it's nuts because we know that, of course, we all want jobs and we all want a thriving economy, but we also want to be healthy people. And we can't have both without having ground rules, without having guardrails and guidelines. And the corporate sector has, again, not all of the corporate sector, but many companies have proven that without guardrails, without regulations, they will sell dangerous products. They will knowingly sell dangerous products, and they will lie about it. And that's why we have a regulatory system in the first place. And that's why that regulatory system needs to be based on objective science.
I want to go back to something you pointed out, Professor. You are a historian of science. You made parallels between DDT and glyphosate and the use of dangerous chemicals among big industry players, and how it takes so much time for us to be able to look back and draw the connections between these damaging chemicals and behaviors and human health and the health of our environment. That is all to say, are we seeing something of the same? Is this what it's always been? Is there anything anomalous about this moment? Or is this just the continuing pattern of big industry and powerful government players working together, not in the interest of the public's health?
Well, that's a tricky question. And of course, as a historian, I would always say no two historical situations are ever exactly the same, but we can often see parallels. And sometimes the parallels and the differences can help us figure out what we need to do to be effective. So what's similar in this case is in both cases, you have a toxic chemical that was sold to the American people and sold to American farmers as safe and effective, but it turned out it really wasn't safe and, ironically, not even entirely effective because animals and plants develop resistance. And we saw that in the DDT case, and we're already seeing it with glyphosate now. But the big push was the claim that it was safe, when in fact it really wasn't. The difference, the really big difference, is the role of government and regulatory agencies. So in the 60s, when Rachel Carson, and I want to give credit to hundreds of scientists at fish and wildlife agencies across the United States, documented the harms that DDT was doing, the federal government supported that science. President Kennedy had a commission that reviewed it, largely concluded that Rachel Carson and the scientists were correct. The EPA was created under Richard Nixon in 1970, and one of the first things that the EPA did was to ban the use of DDT in the United States. So there you had the government supporting science and working with scientists to protect the American people and American wildlife. Now we have a situation where you have the government actively working to undermine scientific evidence and actively working to undermine the integrity of the regulatory agency whose job it is to protect us from these sorts of harms.
So the regulatory system is failing to do the job here. And I mean, at least since the EPA launched, in the 1970s, does this feel like a unique moment in that way, in terms of the regulatory system then breaking down and not doing what it was built to do?
Yes, I mean, again, I don't really like the word unique because we've been seeing pressure on the EPA for a long time. The corporate sector has been working to pressure EPA not to strongly regulate potentially dangerous chemicals, really ever since the EPA was created. But I will say unique in the sense that the kind of total system breakdown that we're seeing now, where the head of the EPA, whose job it is to regulate, has told us that he doesn't believe in regulation.
A lot of this feels like some disempowering discussion we've been having here, Professor Oreskes. So I want to end on a note that looks at some of the power that people can have. I want to play a clip from a listener, Sheila from Ann Arbor. She contacted us by email about her concerns with herbicide use on Michigan roadsides.
In 2019, the Washtenaw County Road Commission wanted to stop cutting the weeds on my street, and they wanted to start spraying herbicide along the road instead of cutting. When I learned about the herbicides, they were really, really poisonous. Not only do they kill the grass, they kill the butterflies, they kill the bees, they kill the frogs, they kill the trees eventually, and they kill us.
So Sheila and her neighbors raised their voices, and they were able to get the city to stop using this herbicide. I want to end on that note about the power of people like Sheila and her neighbors when it comes to changing local environmental policy. What can you say about that in the last minute we have here?
Brilliant. Thank you, Sheila. I think that's such a brilliant example, and it proves something really important that we always have to remember. This chemical may be legal, and there might not be a lot we can do about that in the short run, but we don't have to use it.
Naomi Oreskes is a historian of science at Harvard University and the author of many books, including Merchants of Doubt: How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Climate Change. Professor Oreskes, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
It's the Metro on WDET, and thank you to listener Sheila from Ann Arbor for reaching out to us. You can get a hold of us too. Email us or send a voicemail. You can reach us at metro@wdet.org or open up the WDET mobile app. Up next, cancer rates are rising among younger people. Is there anything we can do to change that? We'll dig into it. That's next on the Metro. Stay with us.